You could go online and watch videos about step-siblings, or you could read epic fantasy, and you know what? It may just be the same. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and one book in particular today, and that is Navola by Paolo Bacigalupi. It came out on Tuesday. I'm done with it. I absolutely loved it, and we'll do the thing that I do with books that are just out. I'll give you a quick synopsis, then I'll obviously give you a sort of spoiler-free review on like why you should go and read it immediately, and then we'll descend into spoilers where I talk about some broader issues that I think are important that you can take out of this book and so forth, but those will be spoilered. So yeah, depending on your tastes on these kind of things, you might want to first read the book, which you really should, because it is fucking good. So that's what we'll do. And yeah, before we do that, I want to do something that I've done a long time ago and then kind of forgot because I'm terrible, and that is say a thank you and give a cheers to one of my Patreon backers. And if you want to, also get one of those personalized, then, there's a Patreon. Anyway, this one goes out to Denise. Thank you, Denise, for being a patron, and cheers. Alright, so what is Navola? Navola is epic fantasy. It's historical fantasy, and it's called literary fantasy by the publisher, but, ignore that stuff for a while. It is a magical world, but may not have that much magic, and it follows the lives of a lot of people in a city-state that is called Navola, and so it has that weird Renaissance Italy vibe with maybe some magic and some stuff slightly twisted. If you like that kind of stuff, this will be it. If you like slightly unreliable, probably, first-person narrators, this is also something you'll get here. If you like intrigue, if you like all of that stuff, this is also here. It has all of these elements. It is part one of at least 2 books. There may be a third, I don't know, but probably 2 books. So it does, end fairly closed in itself, so you're not, left on a cliffhanger, but be aware there is a second book. Beyond that, it is all the things you expect from epic fantasy in the 21st century. It has a lot of stuff about the world. It has a lot of violence and darkness, so yeah, be aware of that. There will be dark parts in here. It is very much an adult book in that regard. It has a lot of wonderful world description, and yeah, some really interesting nuanced characters and how they view the world, how they interact with each other, and so forth. That's what you can expect from Navola. So, if you like all of these things, Renaissance Italy, crime, power struggles, people growing up, learning the world, encountering problems, all of that stuff, yeah, go read the book. It's really good. So let's talk about spoiler-free review things on why I think you should read this book. You should read this book because, it shows you what epic fantasy, which is supposedly dying, is able to do these days if you just, step slightly away and do some interesting things with it while taking a lot of lessons from the past, from other big stories that have been out there. Yes, the back cover calls it The Godfather meets Game of Thrones, which is tacky. But yeah, maybe not the worst of these kind of descriptions that I've heard before. If you like, in that regard, it does a lot of interesting things that are familiar, but are just twisted far enough to make it unique and new and interesting. And yeah, that's, reason enough to read it. It also has really, really cool, well-developed characters that you can fall in love with, which is another reason why you might want to read it. It also has really cool animals, and we all like animals, right? So you might want to read it for that reason, which is another reason to read it. It's really good. It has some really interesting twists in there that you may not see coming, and when they come, they may still, feel like, wow, I should have seen this coming the entire time. So it has twists that are well plotted. It has all of these things, and it uses a language that is, very much the top tier of fantasy prose that you can get these days in epic fantasy. It's right up there with the really, really, really good ones. So all of that are reasons why you should read this book right now, because this may be the strongest, darker epic fantasy of the year. say I, as someone who hasn't read a single other one that is coming out this year. So take it with that grain of salt, and just trust me and read the book, because, yeah, trust me, you won't be disappointed. It has a slow start. We're talking epic fantasy, and it picks up pace a lot, and it just really is a really, really gripping narrative. So go read it for all of these reasons. And now let me talk about this with some spoilers and why I think it's worthwhile reading it beyond just mere entertainment, and what we can take out of it, and why I think it's such a really, really cool book. There will be spoilers from here on out. So while I take a sip of beer, you go and read through these 500 pages or whatever it is quickly, and then we'll talk about the rest. All right. So, what I'm going to talk about here will be 2 or 3 or 4 points, one after the other. And I want to start with something that I think is interesting. And that is a perception of books and how we talk about books, and what that says about our way of reading fantasy, what that says about book marketing, and so forth. And that is, well, we're jumping off with the Godfather meets Game of Thrones, which is that back cover blurb. I made the mistake of, after reading the book, and talking to some people, reading a lot of people saying this is very much Paolo Bacigalupi channeling Guy Gavriel Kay, and that is also true, but I think what it shows is that we have very much reduced our way of thinking about books, the way of how we talk about books, in that we find like one specific similarity and say like this is like this, but maybe slightly else. Maybe we manage to do like 2 works that we compare to each other, and that is interesting because it kind of shows how we narrow our horizons, even if we have read a lot of books. And it's like, yeah, it's got intrigue, it's got to be Game of Thrones, right? Or it's like a Renaissance style setting with not a lot of like visible magic, so it's almost Renaissance Italy with like the serial numbers filed off. So that's Guy Gavriel Kay, right? Because he's like one of the few authors really, really doing that a lot, and yeah, that's also true. But if you've only read these 2 books, or if those are like the only 2 things you compare it to, you're missing out on a lot of other things that this book also has. And this, I think, is just, a general sort of issue that we have in the way we talk about fantasy, that we try to make comparisons, which makes sense when we try to recommend stuff to other people, but it also limits the way we read a book. Because if you go like, well, yeah, it's Renaissance Italy, it's historical fantasy with very little magic, so I'm going to read this like a Guy Gavriel Kay book. So everything I'll read while reading this book, will be me comparing it to Guy Gavriel Kay books, and that's unfair, because obviously Guy Gavriel Kay and Paolo Bacigalupi are very, very different authors with very different backgrounds and very different approaches to writing fiction, just because they choose the same approach here, which is, write a fantasy book or write an historical novel without having to actually deal with all those history nerds that complain if you get like the armor of one dude wrong. That's something that like we've seen all the way back to Robert D. Howard going into the Hyborian Age instead of writing historical novels, because it's just a pain in the ass to write historical fiction, because it limits your ability to go off script, so to speak, and you have to defend every single choice you make when going off script. So that's not a new approach. It's just that especially with Guy Gavriel Kay becoming a bit more popular in the bookfluencer sphere of the last couple of years, that's the one thing that everyone compares it to. Similar if you go and compare it to Game of Thrones, like the back cover does. There are scenes and elements in this book that are very, very Song of Ice and Fire-ish. Of course there are. But there's a lot of other stuff that we kind of miss if we just read it as, not Game of Thrones, but sort of like Game of Thrones, so we compare it to that. And I think it's interesting, and it's something I've personally realized when I read the book. I was not aware of the Guy Gavriel Kay thing, because I hadn't read the reviews before, but obviously I had read the promo text that came out when the book was announced last year, so I was like, there will be Game of Thrones-y stuff in here. And I picked up on a lot of these while reading. I was like, oh, he does George R. Martin here. And I'm like, that's unfair to the writer, and I have no solution to how to deal with that in the future, but I think it's interesting to talk about that. And now let's move on to the next interesting part that is sort of like a jumping off thing here, from a segue from this our reader expectations, and talk about influence and writing here. Now, those of you who know Paolo Bacigalupi have probably or maybe slightly surprised when you heard that he was writing a historical fantasy, because, he's mostly famous is the word here, for his sci-fi books, his very environmentalist, eco-sci-fi books, The Wind-Up Girl and The Water Knife, and a bunch of short stories that are sort of in the same kind of sphere, and they are all brilliant, and you should go and read them immediately. If you haven't, seriously, do so. So this seems like a massive sort of change of direction. And then maybe some of you have read the Tangled Lands short stories that he did together with Tobias Bockel, which are fantasy, but also still very much environmentalist fiction. I even have a video about them from like 2 or 3 years ago that like 5 people watched because, Anyway, go read those stories. They're really, really good. So I wasn't as surprised to see Paolo go into more fantasy. But then, something I realized while reading this book is it feels refreshing and that's something that Bacigalupi has said, that he was not originally planning to publish this, but going into, just trying out stuff. And I think this freedom kind of comes across because it does show a lot of fantasy influences, and I can obviously not guarantee that Paolo Bacigalupi has read all of these books, but there are very specific elements in here that that I found that reminded me of other stuff, and I'm going to go through a bunch of these to show that like fantasy is always built on the stuff that came before, and then putting your own voice to it and taking the bits that work and mixing them together in new ways. So there is a lot of that stuff in here. There are very specific scenes that feel Game of Thronesy. There is obviously a very specific situation of, combining explosive violence with sort of important festivals, something like, we have seen in, say, a Red Wedding in A Song of Ice and Fire. And if you've read that book, that's immediately the connection you're going to make. And that's understandable. And I assume that, on the other hand, that twist that George R. Martin brought, that massive Red Wedding thing, is one of those set pieces that will end up in fantasy language and have ended up in fantasy language ever since. But there are obviously also other parts. For example, there's another big spoiler here, is like when our main character, Davico, ends up blinded and in prison and being dragged out to sit at his captor's table during his birthday celebrations, naming days in this case. So, now, those of you who have maybe read the books of Amber may remember that that's exactly what happens to Corvin during the end of the first book, Nine Princesses in Amber, and the second one, Guns of Avalon, which is very much what Eric does to Corbin. Blinds him, puts him in a hole, and, parades him in front of his court as sort of like a symbol, mostly during his birthdays. Now, obviously, can I prove that Paolo Bacigalupi has read the books of Amber? Probably. Obviously I can't, but it feels very obvious when you've read both books. And once again, that idea of having, it's obviously something that Roger Zelazny took from somewhere else from history, the idea of parading your sort of like your enemies that you have vanquished, to parade them in front of your soon-to-be enemies as a symbol of power, of your power, as a tool of intimidation. That's something that came from history, but this specific set piece with the dungeon and being blinded and so forth, that's something that Roger Zelazny brought to the fantasy language as a set piece, and it shows up here again. There's obviously other elements here that are the same, that are similar, like the first-person narrator that may or may not be very, very much unreliable. I mean, I assume that all first-person narrators are unreliable by definition, but so far it's a bit difficult to trust that with Davico, but he does certain things that we know from the big first-person narrators in fantasy, those obviously being, someone like Severian or whatever the name in The Wizard Knight by Gene Wolfe is. Like, Gene Wolfe is very much comes through, I think, in these elements when it comes to like the way, as a first-person character, he describes the world. He, talks about stuff, interjects, like, I have to say this even though it pains me, I have to do this, but this will happen later, and so forth. The playing with time in a way. This feels like something that Gene Wolfe brought to the table. I mean, obviously there have been first-person narrators in fantasy for a long time before that, but Gene Wolfe kind of brought that very specific form almost to perfection, and brought that as an element into fantasy. And we can see it later with Fitz as a first-person narrator in The Realm of the Elderlings novels, and have Fitz and the Fool in it by Robin Harb. Now, can I prove which one of those was the inspiration for Paolo Bacigalupi? I cannot, and I don't have to, but it's interesting to see how these bits are added over time to the vocabulary of fantasy, and built from there. As I said, this book is full of these kind of things. I would guess it might just be a bit more Fitz in there than Severian, in that there is clearly a bond of Daviko's with the natural world in the same way that, say, Fitz has when, with his dogs and so forth. And I always keep forgetting the names of his wolf and whatnot. But it's also something that you can see with Bran. And there's certainly parallels in the opening parts of this book between, say, Bran in the Song of Ice and Fire novels and Daviko as someone who, is still a bit naive. He rides a pony where everyone else is riding horses. This very much comes in. And the pony is called Stub. Now, I can't prove that this is sort of like a nod towards Stibba, which is the pony that Merry rides when he rides with King Theoden with King Theoden from the battle at Helm's Deep to the other place that I keep forgetting right now, but when he has a pony. Do I know that? No, I don't, but it's certainly an idea to have these bits and pieces come up again and again, and this is something that shows you what a lot of what really good fantasy writers do. They are in contact, they're in conversation with the field, and a lot of times writing fantasy is, taking the things that gave you joy as a reader, that have stuck with you, and just playing with them and going like, well, this is what I would do if I had these elements. And going from there, this is certainly something that we can see in Navola in a way that I found very, very remarkable here. Now, there's a lot more, obviously, from that kind of perspective, and I probably missed a lot of other elements that I have not looked. I mean, obviously we have assassins in here, and our characters getting some assassin training, which is something that once again you get in a lot of books, in particular with Fitz in the first Farseer trilogy, for example. All of these elements are there, and as fantasy readers, if we have read enough other books, we'll recognize these bits and pieces and go yeah, this is really cool. Another one is looking at faces, trying to read faces, which is very much a Dune kind of thing, for example. There's all these bits, and putting them together in a new way is the strength of good authors. Taking as many of these bits as possible is another strength of good authors, and Paolo Bacigalupi is clearly experienced enough a writer to do this. Now, the question may be, how much of that is because he's coming sort of late to the fantasy game, coming from a far more realistic approach to writing in his sci-fi novels, in both Wind-Up Girl and The Water Knife, which are hyper-realistic and much closer to a near future, very political, very direct. So how much of that kind of spills over into this book as well is the question. How much is this a very different book, and how much is it not? And the answer is there's both. Now, I would argue that some of these underlying issues that obviously interest Bacigalupi kind of come in here as well, which is obviously a concern for our environment. That's something that comes up again and again and again, because it's kind of the things that drive us as people. We have core concerns that will come out. It's whatever I do, I will sooner or later mention that capitalism kind of sucks. It's just part of my being. It may take different shapes depending on what I'm talking about right now. I just brought it up as an example instead of really, hating on capitalism. But you see what I mean? So there's a lot of environmental stuff in this book in different terms. It's a fantasy book. There's a lot of nature stuff, and we see how nature is a system, and how animals interact with plants, how connecting to nature is a skill, but it's also a very specific power. Now, how we can feel at peace if we're part of nature and don't act against nature that much. But because this is not, The Wind-Up Girl or The Water Knife, it is phrased in fantasy terms. It uses fantasy vocabulary. It looks at individual plants and so. And this is great because it, on the other hand, once again goes back to a classic of fantasy. J.R. Tolkien, who we haven't mentioned a lot yet. was very concerned about the environment from a much more conservative and somewhat problematic perspective. But the love for nature really shines through and reminds you of, say, Tolkien, even though it's handled in a very different way in this book. So we have very loving nature descriptions, but they sort of have a larger thing beyond just like nature is just beautiful and we need to worship trees, or we need to at least venerate the party tree. So we have that, but then, there's also the idea of inventing languages, and that's obviously been a staple for a long time. But this one is a very Italian, Latin sound-alike language that works really well because you kind of understand what's going on here without, really having to learn Italian or Latin. And it took me a couple of paragraphs to realize, this is made up. It sounds Italian, but it's not. And it works really well. But that's once again like a staple of the fantasy genre, but it's going in a specific way, because something that we can take from Tolkien is like find a language that gives you a sense of place. And with Tolkien, that obviously works on a more like abstract level because he wants to, impart something about like elvish nature or whatever. This one is a language that sounds very Italian, which brings me to the next part, which is like, this is a very Italian feeling setting. And there's very specific historical parallels you can draw. There's obviously banking houses, you're like Medici or whatever. You have cities, you have a bunch of warring city-states that are sort of dreaming of like their imperial past, which is something you see in the 14th century, 13th, 14th century with like people like Boccaccio, with people like Petrarca and so forth. This idea of like looking back at Rome, one of those things that you see in the Renaissance, like for example, Machiavelli wrote a bunch of Roman history and was much more interested in Roman history than, anything else. It's just like we always hear about the prince nowadays instead of anything else. So we have that. But there's also other things like, how do you just make something feel Italian? And this is sort of like where interjections come in, which this book has, where Bacigalupi brings us like quotes and texts and so forth from the world. Now we have once again, it's the technique we have seen before. The Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson does it. Obviously, Dune does it. A lot of other books do it well. Here we have different ones that achieve different things, including one that is a song about like how characterizing, stereotyping all of the different cities. And these things come up again and again in this book. And if you've ever been to Italy, you know that hating and having terrible stereotypes about everyone else is very much part of like Italian culture still today, and it also was very much a part of that Renaissance warring city-states kind of things with your Borgias, with your Sforzas, with all these different groups in all these different Italian cities, including the idea of having mercenary companies that are almost like forces on their own. They're your condottieri and so forth, which although they are slightly later in time, but we have all these elements from history, and they make a world that is slightly different from ours, but only slightly. Which is, this is very much Bacigalupi channeling a bit of Guy Gavriel Kay once again in the way he does that. But it also, once again, is something that channels Bacigalupi's look at like worldviews in a lot of other ways as well, because, if you've read other books, like science fiction books are obviously much more tied to our world, at least these near-future eco-science fiction is. But like, cities in the past still worked very much the way that our lives work as well, because power politics and money politics is still in there. It just takes different ways, different forms. The Renaissance kind of way is slightly different from ours, but not as much. You have these ideas of like far travel and far trade that you had in the Renaissance with, your Marco Polos coming back and talking about stuff. And you have these equivalents here. You have obviously the difference between like the poor and poorer masses, the countryside and the town, the idea of a debauched nobility or a debauched clerical nobility on the one hand, and you have your rabid poor priests. And there's a Savonarola character in this book that gets mentioned, but he hasn't shown up yet. But you can recognize these bits and pieces, and Bacigalupi does that incredibly well by making it feel realistic in that it reflects our experiences of the world, while also still feeling magical and fantastic by sometimes just like slightly changing names, inventing flowers, having animals that sound very much like the thing we know. You have your rock bears and your shadow panthers, and which, once again, is something that you can see with, say, Gene Wolfe and the Shadow of the Torturer, the Book of the New Sun, where you have characters encountering fauna and flora that sounds almost like ours, and you think it might be ours, but then it's slightly twisted. So all of these bits and pieces make this book really successful on that one major level, which is taking a lot of familiar things and then going through them, just like giving them their own spin. And the book also does that almost in, like, it has several parts, and they change genre in a way. You have your growing up, your Bildungsroman almost kind of thing, with a lot of nature and Daviko learning like his trade and trying to learn how to be a banker and all that stuff. And then you have your more like romance stuff in there, and then you have your power politics, grimdark, epic fantasy, horror stuff, or like crime fiction sort of bits in there. And the shifting between tone and shifting between these different ways or different modes of writing, I think, is another thing that you can do with epic fantasy in a way that you can't necessarily do with other forms, because it is so sprawling, and you can have a book that is like shifts pace a number of times because you're entering a different story mode almost, and you can see this in here. For example, another part that I found interesting is there's a scene in there that I could have sworn is taken from The Dragon Waiting by John Ford, when Daviko and their assassin cross over the mountain passes to a different place to negotiate an alliance, which I think happens almost the same way in The Dragon Waiting. So we have all these bits and pieces from all over the place, from different books, taken together, turned into a Bacigalupi novel that represents the same sort of like basic concerns about human life, the idea of free will or destination, free will versus predestination, the idea of human nature, loyalty, the way that power and so forth kind of forces us into very specific roles that may dehumanize us over time, which is something we very much see in this book, and I suspect we'll be seeing more of that in the future. Which leaves us only like one final thing to talk about, and that is sexuality, because yes, there's a lot of sex in this book, or maybe not, and I think this is interesting in two ways. On the one hand, it is, fairly open when it comes to, say, homosexuality and stuff like that, which you may think is a very modern thing, but, and this is why it works so well, is actually not that much. Now, one of the key texts for, Renaissance Italy, or late High Middle Ages Italy, is, of course, the Decameron, or Decamerone, by one Boccaccio, a book you really should read, and I may do like a video on it really soon. And that book is a very bawdy story. It's probably an influence on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and it's 100 stories, and they involve mostly sex, most of that sex being adulterous sex with priests or nuns or both, including homosexuality and everything else. So that level of bawdiness that comes through, and that Bacigalupi chooses to portray the city, the idea how everything is sort of sexual, also bawdy, how the main priest, who's, sort of the bishop kind of person, is very fat and very much engaging in all kinds of lechery with different nuns, and also like all about eating ingredients. A lot of this stuff that may feel fairly modern in that regard is really adding to the idea, or like adding verisimilitude to a Renaissance, or, as I say, like High Middle Ages, late Middle Ages feeling, and reaffirming the sort of atmosphere, which I think, to bring this all slowly back to where we started off, differs somewhat from what you may get in a book, say, like Tigana by Guy Gabriel Kay, which sort of has a similar sort of almost Renaissance, Middle Age, medieval Italy style setting, but is very much holding back on that level of like earthy bawdiness, the way that is very much about sexuality and enjoying good living in all kinds of ways, and having that more bawdy kind of comedy element in there, I think shows very much on the one hand the difference between how we represent historical episodes, how we, there's a term called medievalism that you can see from, discourses that someone like, say, Umberto Eco had on the topic of how we represent and how we think of the Middle Ages. And a lot of times we have these very specific images of regions and eras, and while we sort of, have an idea of late medieval, early Renaissance Italy with like warring states, some of us have hopefully not watched the Borgia, different Borgia TV shows, but we have these ideas of debauchery on the one hand, but we rarely think of them as being part of the times, like being already part of the art and general literature and art of the time, because what we think about there is more like your your Da Vinci's and your Raphael's and so forth, and that I think is one of the brilliant things that Navola manages to do, is take those original sources, turn them into a fantasy book, make them sound incredibly and feel fairly modern in the way it shows up everywhere, and being much closer to sort of the sort of era that it has inspired the world than we might think, by bucking the trend of playing to our common image of an era of, what we think of like medieval or Renaissance or whatever Europe, but being closer to the reality and thus being different, which, just adds spice to the kind of story that we get here and to the world that we get here. So to wrap this all up, from what I can say, Navola is very much a masterclass in contemporary epic fantasy and historical fantasy by, on the one hand, being very, very good at understanding a place and sense and time, in this case, Renaissance Italy, with, possibly doing a lot of research, or maybe not, on, the kind of, culture and atmosphere that we can, as far as we can reconstruct it, and breaking out of the image that we already have through historical fantasy and historical fiction and television and movie productions of whatever we've seen about that time, on the one hand, and then mixing that with a lot of inspiration from all over the fantasy, science fiction, genre fiction, and general literary fiction field, and taking all of these things, mixing them together, in, as I said, like a state-of-the-art way that we have like right now, turning all of that together and creating something that feels eerily familiar and refreshingly different at the same time, which is, at the end of the day, what fantasy or like any form of literature truly is. It's taking everything that has come before, standing on those shoulders of giants, and then taking a leap off into the unknown and adding your own stuff to that, which is really, really good. So yeah, these are my thoughts on Navola by Paolo Bacigalupi. I think it's really one of the best books I've read this year, and I've read a bunch of really good books that came out this year so far, and so really, really good. I hope that if you haven't read it and watched this whole conversation anyway, you still enjoy it. I try to keep away from the most brutal spoilers. If you have already read it, let me know what you thought about it down in those comments. I don't know, like, subscribe, yell at me in the comments, do all of those wonderful things. There's a Patreon, I don't know, if you want to feel pretentious, share the video with like friends and tell them, hey, I watched this video, I have read this book, it's really, really good, you should do that. Even if you haven't watched it, even if you haven't read the book, it may make you look really erudite, and that's something we can all strive for, right? Including me. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. I'll talk about something else. Possibly Bury Your Gaze, possibly something else. We will see. Thanks. Cheers.